Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael S. Siebert. You're listening to Equal Chance to be Unequal, my podcast about unlocking human potential through helping people disconnected from their purpose uncover and live their purpose.
We're going to talk first about some of the things with regards to change that I'm seeing in society. Maybe there's some other things that you're seeing. But what can we do to really thoroughly drive employee engagement at a deep level? Because there's a ton of stuff changing in our world, and how do we keep people engaged over a long period of time when they aren't necessarily wanting to? So I want to talk about is a little bit some societal changes that I'm seeing. Maybe there's some things that you guys are seeing. I'm going to give you some interesting employee engagement statistics. I'm going to talk about 5 methods that I'm seeing as being really critical to driving that engagement. And then maybe a little bit, depending on time, talk a little bit about a one-to-one coaching process that I think is really critical that will help you to engage people who might be a little bit skeptical of change, or maybe who aren't yet on board with a specific change you're trying to implement. What can we do to engage them in a meaningful way so that you can implement your changes more smoothly? So give me a little bit of context. You're welcome to speak up, just say whatever. Are there specific things, maybe within your personal life or within your business or within society, politically, whatever? Is there some change that you see coming in 2018 that you've been thinking about? So what do you got?
You heard from me all afternoon, so I'm going to keep myself.
So Jenny and I have already had a couple of hours together because she was kind enough to pick me up at the airport. So any changes you guys are expecting? Tax adjustments? So tax adjustments, big ones. Okay, that's a good one. What else?
Self-driving cars.
Oh, okay, so self-driving cars becoming a bigger part of society, especially in kind of city centers. That's a big one.
Hope so.
Okay, what else?
All the job changes.
Job changes, how so?
How soon?
No, how so? Like, in what way?
New positions, changes within the company.
Okay. So lots of people moving around inside companies and promotions and transfers, moving to other organizations. Sure. What else?
Conglomerations.
Conglomerations?
Retirement.
You talked there first, right? So that was actually one of the things that I was thinking about too, John, was M&A. But retirement, right? There is a big adjustment happening in society where millennials back in October of 2015 became the biggest percentage of the American workforce. And so now that there's a bigger percentage of them in the workforce, it's okay for baby boomers and some Gen Xers to consider retirement in some meaningful way as their savings accounts have become built back up, whatever it might be. So both of those, very, very good. What else? Any other things you guys are seeing? Or expecting? That is stressing you out, worrying you?
More of a change. It's been a focus on data over the last couple of years, but I see over 2018 even more of a focus on how important data is to drive strategic initiatives in business.
Sure. Yeah, data has become a very, very big part of us making decisions and being okay with whatever those decisions are. I'm not going to go too much into this because I'll talk about them a little bit again at 6:30. But if we look at the previous year, Jenny and I were talking about this over lunch this afternoon. A lot of activity with Amazon buying Whole Foods. I think recently CVS just bought Aetna or is in the process of buying Aetna. Have you guys seen other M&A activity in 2017? Or been?
Disney bought part of Fox.
They totally did. Thank you for that. Disney and Fox. And so we're seeing a lot of that. And so what is happening is that as there's more and more cash available and there's more change on the horizon, C-suites are looking at it and saying, well, what do I do with this? How do I do something meaningful with this? How do I get ahead of it? So that's definitely going to happen. There's an economist out of a company called Princeton Energy Advisors that thinks that there's going to be a 20 to 25% dip in the stock market at some point this year, just because we're in the second longest bull market in history. Something's got to adjust or change. You don't think so? John, no?
I don't think so.
Okay.
You don't think so? Why not?
You didn't squeeze as much out, in GDP growth and everything else that we have on a 10-year cycle.
Okay.
It's going to be a longer tube. It's going to be a longer run.
Elongated in this case.
Yeah.
Okay, which would be nice, right? Keep people
Everybody
relatively
said that
happy.
when the next president took, and it went from 18 to 26 now. So people are on the sidelines are probably not so happy about that.
Yeah.
Do
Yeah.
you think that's going to happen by the end of 2018, or you think it's going to stretch into 2019?
This particular economist thought that this was going to happen within 2018.
Okay.
So this.
Your predictions in like
Yeah.
Q2 2019 right
Okay, fair enough. Interesting thing to consider for each of our respective businesses is if this happens, what do we do to kind of plan for it? And the last one is that I've seen through a couple different articles is that the American mall becomes the new town square, because most of the time we go into a mall and we expect to buy a product. We go there to buy some sort of piece of clothing or some product we're going to use, but we can now buy most of those things online somewhere, and we don't have to physically go anywhere to be able to purchase those things. So what's going to happen is that many mall operators are going to think about creating services or experiences within those malls and get people to just go there. So whether it's restaurants or whether it's something to do with the physical body, like a manicure or getting your hair done, or some of the malls in Phoenix where I live, they're doing much more things around like indoor skydiving, things that get people into the place to have an experience, as opposed to thinking about how do we just go there to buy something. So what's going to happen is that young people, or people in general, are going to want to go there just to have that experience as opposed to just buying product or service. So a couple things with regards to norms. We have looked at society, and there's been a couple of things that have been really interesting. Is that I think for my parents or my grandparents, right, everybody used to wear some sort of a suit and or a dress to go to work every day, but that doesn't happen so much anymore. We don't feel like we have to do that. So the norm of having to look a certain way when we go to our corporate or organizational role is now basically being replaced by you can really wear whatever you want. So there's a big norm changing there in terms of how we show up to work. And so there are some folks that still want to dress really nice, and there are others that don't really worry about it too much. There's also a really, really big shift in the sharing economy. What we used to have to do with paying for hotels or paying for taxi cabs and things like that, we now can pay our peers to be able to do that. And so it's much, much more interesting to think about. In the sharing economy, we can now help in a very decentralized way. We can help people. And if you think back 20 years ago, what was the probability that you would have placed your 13, 14, 15-year-old daughter into a stranger's car and said, take this person over to the airport? Like 20 years ago, the probability of you doing that was almost zero. But now it seems perfectly normal that we would do that, and it's accepted. The norm around trusting strangers or doing work or partnering with strangers in a way that we hadn't done that before is actually quite normal and actually quite accepted. Another thing here around the Facebook, how many people have Facebook Messenger on their phone? A couple of you? Okay, have you read the details and the legal stuff around that and what that means?
No.
No? Martin? Okay, so just so you're aware, right, even when the phone is off, even when it's off, turned off, they actually have the right to be able to record anything that's being said around you, and it actually has the capacity to take pictures. Even when the phone is off, you're not touching it, and you don't have the capability of it.
I didn't know that. I don't have anything to hide.
There's an awful lot of stuff that is now being forced out into the open because we no longer have privacy.
The only reason I have it is Greg sends me dumb videos. The marital thing.
Whether it's our spouse that wants to hear these things, but Facebook now has the capacity, right? They want to be able to know what you're talking about. So if you're talking about something, even if the phone's sitting on the table, and then all of a sudden you open up Facebook and you're starting to see ads that are about the very thing that you just talked about, you know why. We just live in a world where the norms are changing, right? We're a far more casual place. We now trust peers in a meaningful way, and we now can't expect privacy the way we used to 20 years ago.
And this is just an aside. I was shocked. There's a store I didn't normally go into, but my friend's a teacher, so I went with her into the store because it was a fine store, but it's not Union. I work for Union. I don't shop at Walmart. But I went into Walmart. They sent me an email asking about my customer experience, and I almost died. So I was like, how did they? So it's all gone.
Privacy?
Once, and the privacy is
Yep.
gone. I'm like, really?
So we have to walk comfortably into a world knowing that that's no longer an expectation. We can't have that expectation of privacy the way that our parents or grandparents used to because technology wasn't there. So it's a very, very interesting thing for us to consider is that with many of the changes that are coming, with social norms adjusting and changing, we have to look at ourselves or our teams very differently. So a couple of things. Has anybody heard of Gallup, State of the American Workplace Report? Have you guys read this? A couple of you are nodding your heads.
Fake news.
Fake news?
Just kidding.
It's
Listen to about half of what you said.
okay. So this is an alternative fact, so that we're all on the same page. So Gallup polls about 400,000 people a year around the globe, but they also have a consulting division that looks at what's happening inside of an organization to see who's happy or who's not. So I would encourage you to go to Gallup.com and look for this particular report because there's some really interesting statistics. So when I was talking to Jenny over lunch, in America specifically, right, there are 7.7 billion people globally but there's about 350 million people in America. Of those 350 million, 100 million actually work. And here are the statistics. So of these 100 million workers, 33% are happy, 51% are not happy, 16% are really unhappy. So if you think about the people on your team, let's assume you have 10 people on your team, 3 are really actively rowing the boat forward and they want to move and they want to develop and do the right thing. 5 are just sitting there not really doing a whole lot, they're just kind of hanging out. But 2 are more likely than not trying to stop the boat, row it the other way, drill holes in it in the bottom of the boat, something to make it capsize. So do you guys have those people on your team? Can you mentally envision who they are? See a couple of you shaking your head like I know who those disengaged people are. This is where we have to think about employee engagement and change in a very different way, is that we can trust that 3 people are doing the right thing, driving us forward. 5 aren't doing a whole lot. So how do we get these 5 people to become engaged in a very meaningful way? Or those 2 people, how do we get them off the boat? Because they need to be in some sort of other organization where their personal mission aligns with the mission of the organization more clearly. John?
So how has this changed over, I don't know, the past 10 years?
It remains exactly the same.
So is it kind of like the, 80-20 rule?
How so?
20% of the people do 80% of the work, 80, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think in our society that's going to be true as long as we remain very hierarchically structured. Humans, when they're born, they're wildly creative individuals and they're meant to be very dynamic and unique, but then we put them through the K through 12 system that takes all the creativity out of them. So then they become robots, right? You go through K through 12, then you go to college, and then you go to work, and the structures and systems that underpin all of those are identical, right? You look up to a person who's up on stage and say that he or she is the boss or the expert or whatever. There's always going to be this play of people who like their work are going to produce 80% of the outcome. And there's always going to be a very large percentage that are not happy. If we, over time, shift to what's called a holacratic model, so if you look at Zappos.com and W.L. Gore and Patagonia, they run on holacratic models. They don't run on hierarchical models. You look at their...
Say that word again? Holacratic?
Yeah, so HOLACRATIC. So holacracy is what it's kind of generically called. So they're a much, much better fit for human creativity. And in holacracy, humans have the capacity to choose their own title, choose their own pay range, choose the things that they work on every single day. But each of us, when we hire people onto our teams, we're choosing those things for the people we bring into us. In holacratic models like these other organizations, people walk into a job and say, here's the value I can bring, here are the things that I want in exchange for that. Here's my pay, here's my title, here's what I'm gonna do every day. If we get to a place where that is possible, we're much more holacratic, the probability of the 80-20 rule coming off the plate and everybody being happy is far higher. We're just not there in Western society. It's just gonna take a while.
It's going to be hard to find, there's going to be holes in that though, because there's going to be positions that people don't want to do, but the organization needs it to be done.
Possibly, yeah.
I mean, it's going to be really hard. It'd be hard to implement that across the board.
Yeah.
I imagine.
Correct, and it's never going to be perfect, but I feel that we're going to be able to engage humans at a deeper level in a holacratic model more deeply than we can in a hierarchical model. Because you're allowing the person to be the most authentic version of themselves at work, because they get to pick while they're there and what they're doing and when they work in a way we can't now. If you go to holacracy.org, you can see a list. There's hundreds.
Okay.
So Patagonia is a big one. W.L. Gore is another big one. Zappos.com, which was bought by Amazon a couple of years back, is another big one. And if you holacracy.org, there's a great 2-minute video that talks about it.
Yeah.
But there's a good listing there of other organizations. Okay. It's a different model than what we've been taught, so people push back against it really hard. Because from the very time we go into preschool or to first grade, we're taught hierarchy. So for a human to walk away from that and to think in a very different way is hard. So can Gen Y or Gen Z, can they be more open to it and do it? Yes, because they're very nonconformist. So it's not going to happen in the next 20 years broadly, but it will at some point, probably in our lifetimes, become the predominant model because that's how people really are.
And millennials gravitate towards more of that model, I would imagine.
Yeah. So millennials, just so it's people born between 1980 and the year 2000, right? They do want to be far more nonconformist than Gen X or baby boomers.
See that overlap with the self-employed population? So there's a whole segment of society that just freewheels it.
Yeah, there is definitely a big increase in entrepreneurship as of late, and there's a couple things driving that, right? The millennials, they took on massive quantities of debt, right? There's over 1.2 or 1.3 trillion dollars in debt in America from students thinking that they had to absorb the debt in order to get corporate jobs, but then they went and tried to find the corporate jobs and they weren't there. So what did they do? They defaulted to staying at home, getting married later, not buying assets. Many of them tried the side hustle or something entrepreneurial to be able to make some sort of money to make ends meet. And it works, it's effective, but we also have to remember that most entrepreneurial businesses fail because they're just doing it to make money. They're not really following an interest or a passion. So it's like they're making money, they're just doing something to make ends meet, but we need to figure out how to get them more aligned with things that they're really interested in. And so Jenny and I over lunch were talking about an organization called SeedSpot, which at a very young age, they have a high school program that helps kids identify that passion deep in their heart and allow for them extracurricularly to come up with what's that interest and passion and how do I make money on it. So there are groups and organizations that are trying, and maybe there are incubators and accelerators in Sacramento that are doing the same thing. If we just have to get to kids at a slightly younger age, because it's harder for a person in their 30s or 40s to think about that, because they've had even more time to be kind of indoctrinated with this is the way that life is. Harder later in life, it's easier when it's earlier. Okay, and here's an interesting statistic. I won't focus too much on this, but think about 51 million Americans in America are basically looking for new work, right? They want to find a new job. So it's a really, really interesting statistic from this report. But this one to me is more meaningful. If the organization is small and has less than 25 employees, they have higher levels of engagement because they get to bring their whole selves to work. They get to be more than just that small little defined role inside of the massive corporation. So for those that are more than 5,000 employees, there's a much lower level of engagement. So what I think is going to happen is that in America, there's going to be a small town rules effect, that the various things that a small town has or a small business has, we're going to start seeing more and more of that in large corporations because people need to be allowed to bring their whole self to work and not just work on one function, but work on multiple functions simultaneously. Okay, see the difference between the two? So I have a feeling that this is going to become a bigger part, is that you're going to see more entrepreneurship, you're going to see more small businesses, and you're going to see people broadening their skill set a little bit to be engaged in more things than just one job, right? Because we need all these other things, whether it's a full-time job, a part-time job, entrepreneurship, professional associations, being engaged with an alumni association, faith-based institutions. There's all these places we can go to be engaged. So what this is saying is that we want more than just purely the full-time job. There's got to be something else to life in that context. So a few more things here from this report. So of the people who responded to this particular survey, only 13% think that their leadership team actually communicates effectively to them. So an important statistic for us to consider is that roughly 90% of the people that rest below us think that we need to communicate better, right? So what can we do to communicate more effectively to them? Jenny and I talked over lunch about products like Slack or Basecamp, things that allow us to communicate or sync. There are tools that allow us to basically instant message people really quickly. Or how do we communicate through town halls? Or how do we communicate through better emails? Or what are we doing to stop by a person's office in the moment to get them to engage with us in a way that we wouldn't normally make time for? So communication more effectively would be great. If we look at employee engagement from a gender standpoint, there's a little bit more engagement and happiness in a female versus a male, which is kind of cool. You can see that baby boomers are a little bit more engaged than millennials, just because they're probably a little bit further along in their career and they're probably a little bit happier about the work that they've chosen to do. Probably one of the biggest things for me was this last bullet point, is that it didn't matter to a person if the person was high school educated or had all the way up to a PhD or additional certifications. The level of happiness or engagement was no different. Even if a person just graduated high school or if they went all the way up to having a PhD, whatever happened thereafter didn't trigger more happiness. Just because you invested all that time and effort into education, it didn't make you more happy. It might have made you a little bit more money, but it didn't make you more happy. Okay, so tremendous context to report to think about is that we can continue to educate ourselves, but we don't always have to do it through the traditional methods and means. We can do it through conversations like this, right, which are a little bit more informal, but oftentimes add more value to what we're doing in the moment, as opposed to going like I did back in 2008. I got an MBA, spent $80,000 on something that by the time I was done, I completely forgot everything I learned, And that's fine. The institution is fantastic, but there's just so many more ways humans learn. And what really ultimately made me happy wasn't the degree, it was when I started to change my work and start to focus on work that I really cared about, not the place I was working. Anything here stand out to you guys?
I talk to my leadership team, I may still have decent, kind of, they think I communicate effectively, but then if you go down a layer or two, that's where it gets more lost, or?
I believe so. I don't remember the exact statistics, but the folks that are at the top who are supposed to be doing the communicating of the strategic objectives, they think they're doing a good job. But as you go down to middle management or to entry level, they're thinking that they're not engaged enough or not communicated to enough. So, good point.
A couple things. I thought the baby boomer to millennial would be a bit more of an arbitrage. And then the female to male, if 36% are more engaged than the men, why do we have more men at leadership roles than women?
That's a very good question that I don't have the answer to. Right, and maybe it's a societal thing, and Jenny and I were talking about this over lunch. It's like our society was constructed and built back in the 20s, 30s, 40s on the male being the patriarch and the breadwinner, and that the female was meant to be the stay-at-home mom to raise the family. And so I just don't think that mindset has left Americans yet, that we're still very much in that mindset, even though it's not really truly serving us as a race or as a people. So at some point in the next 20 years, we'll move away from that because we're much, much more accepting now of blended families and, having, two parents of the same sex, whatever it is. I just think that that's an old mentality that existed 100 years ago that we haven't shaken yet. Maybe, hopefully we do. Because, really at the end of the day, this isn't a massive difference in engagement, but it's enough to take note of. But maybe it's also because there are other things that women are just more intuitive about, or maybe it's because they have time off if they're having kids, or they're a little bit more focused on family and they have time for reflection in a way that a man typically doesn't.
And you don't have the age breakdown per engagement level?
The report does, yeah.
Any base relates to being the social person?
I don't believe so. It's possible. I don't remember a statistic about that specifically, but there's the possibility that if a person is really people-oriented, they love being around others, and then they have a job that allows them to do that, that it could raise the engagement higher.
It would be interesting to see the female to male ratio as it changes per age bracket. How, across the board, we can see that change, because as
Yep.
you're saying, this is a bit of an old thought process. Has that already changed? But because we're, that's a blended number from an age perspective, it looks the way it does. Maybe it's a little bit more even
Maybe,
as we get closer.
Yeah.
Or quite the opposite, who knows?
yeah. Something for each of you to consider is to look at the report. It's free on their website, and so it's not something that you have to pay to gain access to. But it's 115 or 120 pages of content, so you got to cycle through it. They've done tremendous work to identify these things. I just really strongly encourage you to look at it, or at least pieces of it, and then try to apply this to your respective teams. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see where it says 33 versus 70. So 33% of Americans like their work, but the reason why they put the 70 there is that through their consulting, what they found is that the organizations that are best in class, 70% of their respective workforces are engaged, meaning they're happy. They have something called the Gallup Q12, which is a 12-point questionnaire, in that if you go through and ask your employees those 12 questions, and then you can basically determine engagement levels based on those 12 questions. And they're very basic, but very important questions to consider. So you can emulate those in whatever way you want, but the goal would be the best-in-class companies are basically double the level of engagement of the average company. How do you get there in a meaningful way? It's about finding ways to drive that engagement. I put this quote up kind of as a joke, but also kind of because it really is that important when you think about employee engagement. And it says, to win the rat race, you have to think and behave like a cat. What does that mean to you guys? In any way? Any thoughts? Political. Why so? Or how so? Okay, that's definitely true. Okay, what else?
Think higher and bigger than people.
Okay, that's a great way to say it too. So thinking higher and bigger than the people that you're, in the rat race with. It's another one. What else?
Um,
Nothing else?
example, a cat is a predator.
Okay.
So that's like a predator.
Being a little bit more offensive,
Yes.
right? And I don't mean offensive as in bad, but being on offense, aggressive. Yeah,
To get what you want.
totally. That's another great way to look at this. This is my way of just reminding us that depending on what type of employee engagement you want out of your respective teams, that you're going to have to do things really differently in the future because social norms are changing. There's a lot of things changing just in general in society that we can't keep doing the same thing over and over again in order to get to where we're trying to go. So how do we rise up a little bit and become the cat in some meaningful way and just think, how is the cat looking at this, or how is an outsider looking at this? Jenny and I were speaking over lunch about the book Good to Great by Jim Collins, and we talked a little bit about McKinsey, who has done a couple of studies in 2008 and 2015. And through these 3 data points or data collection points, what they found was that inside of companies, when we're trying to institute some sort of major change, 70% of the time, the change initiative's stated objectives are not met. They fail to be met. And it's because we're trying to use the same theories and methods and processes over and over and over again in a way that doesn't work. So how do we change that thinking in a meaningful way to be a part of the 30% where we're actually having the success in a very meaningful way? These are things that I think are really important, or 5 major methods that I try to coach people on in finding ways to figure out how to engage a person at a deep level. So I'll go through each of these with some depth. Please raise your hand or just ask a question about these things. But what I'm really focused on is how to get people to be really resilient through change. Underlying, that's the core. We have to find that sense of resiliency. The first one, how do we bring people into the organization? Many of you probably have a standardized process that you utilize. There's probably some sort of job description, probably has to be approved by a team on the inside. There's probably some connection to the stated objectives of the organization, but is there really truly a connection to the values of the business, or is there a connection to the mission of the business? So how many people really focus on mission, vision, and values when you're hiring a person? So a couple of you, okay. I think best practice in this context is basically 50% of why you bring a person in is the soft stuff, and 50% is can they actually do the job, right, in a meaningful way. But many organizations just focus on can the person do the job. I'm basically suggesting or asking that you go a little bit deeper, is to say we're entering into a time where change is just going to be so rampant that we just can't really thoroughly wrap our minds around it yet. So how do you find a person in your world who has already been through massive amounts of change? Because that person who has already hit rock bottom is going to be in much, much better shape. So my goal when I say this is how do we find that person who is very, very perseverant through anything that comes his or her way? Oftentimes what this manifests as inside your organization is that that person has the capacity to, when they have a problem pop up in their respective department or division, what they end up doing is they come to the table with solutions. So how many people on your respective teams say, hey, you know what, I have this particular problem happening, and here are 3 solutions? How many people have that on their teams? Okay, a couple of you again, but it's a very, very small percentage. How do we create a solutions mindset in the mind of a person? What I'm looking for is finding people who can come to the team with solutions first, not just purely, hey, I have this problem, help me deal with it. How can they bring 3 solutions to the table every single time that they know that they have a problem? What we're doing is saying, does this person have the capacity, or have they been at the bottom somewhere? How emotionally intelligent are they? Or how many times have they faced difficulties in their life? And obviously there are plenty of folks that I deal with as a coach that have faced difficulties in some way. And the fact that they've made it through it, or that they've done very, very well to come out of it, is a very, very distinct sign of their capacity to deal with change as it comes our way. Now, is that a part of your typical questionnaire when you're interviewing people? Do you ask them questions about difficulties that they've overcome? Sometimes yes and no. So a couple of you, yes. So how big of a factor is that actually in the interview process?
It's big for me personally.
Okay. So for Jenny, it's relatively big, but for the rest of you, important, not important?
It's one of many.
Okay. Right? Okay. So go ahead and speak about that a little bit more. So how do you focus on that, or why?
So typically I'm interviewing scientists, and most of their technology portion of it has nothing to do with my work. So I focus more on the personality and getting them into the culture, and so making sure that they're adjusted to change, and if they came across some incident with another employee, trying to hear how they resolve it.
Yep.
Just to check.
Yeah, big time. Thank you for that, because this is the game for me when I'm dealing with executives, is that, have you guys ever done an emotional intelligence assessment to kind of look at self-regulation, self-awareness, social awareness, motivation, or empathy? So I have an assessment that I use with many executives that looks at that specifically. And oftentimes, people who are really, really super successful, they're great at 4 of the 5 areas, but the one area that they always struggle is self-regulation, or the capacity to manage their own emotions. So in the moment, they want to win or they want to do whatever that thing is, and they don't have the capacity to stop and to think about what's the best thing for the team or what's the actually best thing for themselves longer term. And so if we can talk about things or come up with interview questions that are built on the person's capacity to stop in the moment and be like, I'm going to lose this battle, and that's okay, because I actually want to win the longer term war. And most executives won't do that because they're so bent on trying to find ways to win in the moment, or that drives them. And I have total respect for that they want that, but it's not always the right thing for that individual's development or for the team. So whether it's interview questions, whether it's figuring out a way to call references, there are probably other ideas that you have around how do we find that solutions mindset, or how do we find that perseverance? So sometimes it's interview questions, sometimes it's something else. Are there things that you guys are doing that help to find that? Do you have other ways that you go about that? Maybe, maybe not.
I think similar in interview questions. But I continue to ask those questions throughout most of my involvement.
Sure.
I'm talking about joining a new company, so it's a little bit different. So I'm interviewing everybody, even though I'm not interviewing.
Right. Yeah, in a meaningful way. So collecting data in other ways is good. This, I can't tell you how important this is, folks. This seems so silly and so kind of unimportant when the strategic objectives of the organization say something else. But this is the thing that can drive high levels of engagement or keep a person with you for a longer period of time. The average millennial, born between 1980 and 2000, they change jobs every 1.4 years. If you want to keep them around, how do you interview for that before they ever come to hang out with you? And it's not that that's bad, right? And they can change as often as they want. And recruiters and executive search firms are much more amenable to that than they were before. But the average baby boomer, I think, is about 4.5 or 5 years. So they're staying in their respective positions a little bit longer. But it still is important to understand that if you want to find resilient people, you're going to have to ask them questions on their front end. You're going to have to talk to their peers. You're going to have to do something to find that, because it's really critical that we do.
So
Right?
if I'm interviewing you,
Okay.
what do you say?
About
Overcoming objections and obstacles. And
how have I done it personally,
Yeah.
or my life has been fraught with those things, from being basically cheated on and left by my wife back in 2008. Sure. What do
Now
you?
we're getting personal.
No,
so-
you can.
Okay, yeah.
You can totally ask anything you want. It's good. I've told the story before, and I don't have a problem telling it now because it's been a huge part of my development. If John was asking me, like, how did I overcome that obstacle or challenge, I'm very transparent about my own world, just because it has been the absolute catalyst to my life changing. I was raised in Michigan. My father has a landscaping and lawn maintenance company. I worked in it for 12 years. Didn't like working there. Ended up coming to Phoenix. Was married at the time. She left me for another man. I started the MBA. Lost my house, lost a pile of money. And so all of these 4 major things basically happened in the same weekend. And it just all hit me at the exact same time, which was a very difficult thing, but it set me on a completely different path that I needed to. So I can talk about how it taught me to be solutions oriented because I didn't have any money. I can talk about perseverance and how I had to rely on coaches like Pam and other people that became a really big part of who I was, and how they helped me to kind of work through it mentally and emotionally, or other friends like Nicole that were just there to be able to help me, have dinner and just kind of talk it through. And then I can talk about what has happened in my life since, how I've converted all of that meaningful, hurtful information and things that happened into what I do now. Because the man that I was versus the man that I am, completely different. But I needed those really, really hard things to happen in order for me to really thoroughly become who I am today. So I would be really interested if, when you ask those questions of people, if they're willing to share that, and then they tell you how it's bettered them and how it makes their career better now. Because my life is totally different than it was back then, but it's really important that it is. That's a good question. In the interest of time, I'll keep it going, but that was a good one. Habit number 2, method number 2, if you will, is how do you develop a deep level of trust with this person? So let's say you've hired an individual, you brought them onto the team, and what do you do to remove the fear of vulnerability? Because this is the thing that oftentimes hurts the development of a relationship, or the speed by which you can actually create a relationship, is that in corporate America, we're told we're not supposed to release specific things about who we are to other people, because then it potentially gives one person power over another. And I just think that's bullshit, and I don't play by that game. So I'm very, very open about the things that I tell people, and I would encourage you to think about this in some meaningful too. If a person is willing to be vulnerable, the probability of them having confidence or sharing, lots of personal information, they're very, very good at offering other people the benefit of the doubt and just understanding that they're going through things that all persons are in some way. How do you do that? How do you figure that out? I'm a big fan of, in the morning, just management by walking around, talking to people, learning about specific things about them. Jenny and I over lunch talked about the way that we kick off team meetings and how we talk about wins and sharing personal information over the weekend that we did. Asking really specific questions about how does a person prefer to be communicated to? What are their core values, or what are they motivated by? How is it that they want to receive appreciation? Because every person's different. Raise your hand if you've taken the 5 love languages quiz. Couple of folks in the room. Okay, well, actually about half the people in the room have. But have you openly shared that language of appreciation with your peers? So John's a receiving gifts kind of guy. But if you don't know how your peers prefer to receive appreciation, how do you help them in that? So my dad, he's a gifts guy. I'm a words of affirmation guy. So if you just say, hey man, you have a really nice beard, or I like your tie, or thank you so much for this time, like that means the world to me. Whereas my dad, he needs things. So that drove a lot of the issues between he and I. And a lot of the executives that I serve, I end up having to serve his or her spouse too. So I ask them each to do the love languages quiz, and I can't tell you how many times there's a difference between the two. One's trying to show a deep appreciation and love for the other, but the other is not receiving it in any way. They're saying I love you in a way that's really commensurate with how their heart wants to receive it, but the other person isn't receiving it. The love is there, but just the communication isn't. Let's take that same idea and apply it to the folks that we're working with. How do they want to receive appreciation? And so you can ask them, whether it's during the onboarding process or in one-to-one meetings, how do you figure that out? Because we each have different types of appreciation. We each have different strengths. We all have different and ideal work environments in which we can work. What are those things? About 1.5 years ago, Financial Executives Research Foundation in New Jersey through FBI said, hey, will you publish a white paper about knowledge transfer from baby boomers down to millennials? So I did a bunch of research, published a white paper with them. And in page 10 of that report, there's actually a series of 8 or 9 questions that if you go right through those questions and ask your peers or ask your direct reports those questions, a lot of this basically comes out. And they're very, very PC. They're very politically correct. It's very easy to ask them, and it's not going to hurt anybody. Robert Half, who sponsored the white paper, basically approved it. Their legal team looked at it, so I know it's legit. So just feel comfort in that. But if you can ask them those questions, get them to be a little bit more vulnerable, establish that trust, the probability of you being able to engage them and make them part of the 33% or increase that 33% for your team is far higher. You don't have to answer this, but think mentally about those folks on your team and say, where do they stand on that engagement spectrum? How engaged are they? How happy are they? And just something like this could mean the world to them because they've never been asked. But it could be really, really helpful. So you're shaking your head in the back like, no, we don't ask these things, but we should.
No, I'm loving this.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
I think there might be in today's world your ability to gain a level of trust given gender roles. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Say that one last time.
In regards to gender roles, I mean, I think
gender roles. Okay.
I think people are trying to gain trust and they don't know where the litmus test is for trust on a lot of things, and where, I mean, we have a lot of women in the room, so it'd be great to hear from them, because I hear from them often that, you know, it's not easy and it's not as transparent as, like, I could be totally transparent with you. You said bullshit, I'll say bullshit, and we're on the same
Sure.
page.
I'll
right?
say bullshit.
Yeah. And these two are, you know, on our island. But I think that in general, though, you get people that are not as comfortable in this setting of building trust.
Sure.
For any reason of historical preference, but I think it's difficult now.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, we've seen that in a lot of references lately. So
Yeah.
Can you talk to that?
I haven't seen data or specific experience that talks about gender one way or the other. What I've seen is patterns in being very, very respectful of a person's communication preferences, right? Accountants and finance people have a tendency towards introversion, and they have a tendency towards a little bit of mental pessimism or feeling less powerful than the environment around them. And so they're going to be less trusting of others just naturally. Whereas a person who's extroverted and people-oriented, they're going to overly trust others without that person even doing anything to earn the trust. Do we have to be very, very cognizant of communication preferences or of gender roles or of motivators or how they want to receive appreciation? Absolutely. We have to find out, how do we ask the right questions to pull out those answers so that we know on a one-to-one level how to make that happen. Are women in society, right, positioned as being more vulnerable and easier to speak with and all those things? Of course. That doesn't mean that it's actually true person to person. That's just how that society tells us, right? It's propaganda. I don't really pay a lot of attention to the mainstream media because there are 6 companies that control 99% of the American media. If you really think about that, you're getting the same message over and over again, which is only a really small pie of what's actually happening in the world. So you just can't listen to that stuff. I think that when you think about it, it's like, well, I kind of see where they're coming from, but it's not really legit. So that's where one-to-one dialogue and breaking all those stereotypes down is way more powerful. To me, anyways. So the third thing here, method number 3, is how do we create an ownership mindset in the new employee or in this person who has just now joined our organization or joined you in some capacity? So what I think is really critical is that we set really super clear expectations for him or her. And I don't think that organizations or people do this very well. So oftentimes, if a person's really busy, so each of you is busy in your own capacity, you don't have time to spend an awful lot of time onboarding a new hire, whatever that is, and all of a sudden now there's a disconnect between your expectations of what he or she is supposed to do and what they actually deliver. So how do we get over that? How do we engage them? Well, you set those really clear expectations of what is expected of them. We want to make sure that we're not micromanaging them. We want to make sure that they're proactive. We want to make sure that they're moving forward in a way that they're constantly networking outside of their normal department. And that can mean that they're going to lunch with people in other departments. Maybe they're meeting other people for coffee. Whatever it is, they're finding a way to know who the other centers of influence are inside the organization and finding ways to spend time with them to learn about what's happening. I also love people when they're super confident. They're great about selling or celebrating other people's wins in whatever way that they have them, or they're just really humble people. They just want to learn about others. We set the expectation for how we want them to behave from a value standpoint, or what's your leadership standpoint, or how often are you going to communicate with them standpoint, for them to be able to understand how to come back and communicate and be a meaningful part of the team. It's going to drive engagement at a very deep level. One of Gallup's questions is, do I have a best friend at work? Like, it's a really basic question, but many of us don't have a best friend at work. How do we, as the leader, set the clear expectation that I am going to be your best friend? And I don't mean that in a weird romantic or a weird personal way. I just mean it's like anytime that person has something that they're struggling with, internal to work or maybe even external, you're the best friend that they get to come and talk to. So how do you set that expectation that that door is always open and always available in a very meaningful way? Because if you do that, that's where your power is. How can you do that? What is the onboarding process, and how are your financial reward systems aligned with strategic objectives or aligned with that person's personal development? And oftentimes there's a disconnect. I can't tell you how many times I go into an organization and although they say that the culture is this or that the strategic objectives are this, the financial reward systems are completely disconnected. They say they want teamwork and they say they want all these things to work together and collaborative, but then the pay structures are as individuals and they're being compensated as individuals. So it's like, if you want to create that culture, you have to make sure that the expectations are set, that the financial reward systems are lined up, and that we're doing things that keep everybody on the same plane. I'm a big fan of organizations that have weekly check-ins somehow with each of their respective employees. How many organizations in here have an annual performance review. So most everybody, a couple of you don't. Late 2015, General Electric put out, their CHRO put out a piece of data that said that at that point in time, they were stopping doing annual performance reviews. So for the last 2 years, they have not done annual performance reviews.
Do they still fire the bottom 5%?
So that the rank and yank thing doesn't happen anymore. When Jack Welch left as CEO and Jeff Immelt came in, they switched their entire culture to an innovation-based one. There's a lot of things that changed. And did you guys hear the story about how he had a second private plane follow him everywhere? There was a lot of crazy things that Jeff and Beth and some other people did that were just not really appropriate for keeping the business on path. When Jeff flew everywhere to go meet people in his respective network, there was always a second private plane following the plane he was in, just in case the first plane went down. Can you imagine the amount of millions of dollars that were spent on fuel or labor or maintenance costs or whatever on the plane? Not only on the first one, but on the second one.
Who's Jack?
No, it's Jeff Immelt. The second, now he's been replaced. But what's happened is that they replaced the rank and yank system with an app. So when a leader interacts with his or her direct report, they automatically key data into an app on their phone, and that becomes the ongoing performance review. Anytime. It doesn't even have to be a weekly check-in, but it can. But now there's an app that is just really, really easy. It was developed internal to GE, but there's no longer the annual performance review. It's an app that you get to check in and say, what's going on with this person on a day-to-day basis. I was in Boston last April, ran into a company called People Productive, which apparently does something very, very similar to that. You pay, let's say, $10 per person who's using this particular app, and you get to, in the moment, on the spot, download information about your person. So if you enter in that he or she is having a specific issue today, the system automatically pops up one of over 1,000 solutions. If the person is struggling with something at home, all you got to do is enter that in, and then all of a sudden, there are all these different solutions that are being offered for you to deal with it on the spot. We're in a world that moves much, much more quickly to be able to set the appropriate expectations to drive that engagement.
A lot of those bigger companies are dropping the real time. For what at least I've seen struggle is that making sure that organization is following through.
Yeah.
Because it's great that you have an app, but how do you make sure that people are using the app? How
Right.
do you make sure that those who are beneath you or, you know, like in this hierarchical version of an organization, that people are actually following through with it?
Right. Yeah, that accountability I can't speak to,
Yeah.
but I think it's a really critical thing to consider.
Yeah.
Is that if they're not entering the data or their performance isn't somehow tied to that, or their employees' development, they definitely need that. Peer accountability or accountability in that context, really critical.
Yeah, conceptually, it makes absolute sense because it should be real-time feedback.
Yeah, it
But
should.
it's hard to implement.
Yeah. Yeah, especially if you don't remember to do the phone thing, or like you said a second ago, we oftentimes get distracted by a number of things in the moment, and then we have to think about going back to it, and then we forget. So there's all these things that happen. So you just have to think of yourself as a leader and say, what is it that I really want to do? How do I want to be known as a leader, and how am I willing to distribute time into that? Because that's really the game, is how do we distribute time? Method 4 here is one of the things that I think about for employee engagement, and one of the key questions on Gallup's report is, does the person have the appropriate resources to accomplish their goals? And when you think about where we're at in America, we have incredible wealth, second longest bull market in history. There's a ton of money coming back because of the tax reform changes. So we've got a lot of capital. It's just a matter of whether or not it's being distributed down to the people who need it, or are the resources being distributed there. The goal here for us as leaders is to figure out how to take all the potential barriers to our and/or our employees' success off the table, so that we can find a way to make sure that goals are completed on schedule, that we don't have a high-stress culture, that we're doing what we can to keep everybody engaged. Open lines of communication, knowledge transfer, these things matter so much when we're thinking about providing resources. And I'm not just saying, do they have the budget to be able to do the things that they need to, but do they have ongoing learning opportunities? Are we giving them chances to engage groups like FEI or other professional associations to learn or to meet new people? Because the way that humans learn is so interesting and different. Anybody heard of the Center for Creative Leadership? Nobody?
I heard it from you last time.
Did you?
We had that.
I might have talked about it briefly. They have some really interesting stuff. one of the things that I love about CCL is they came out with a new kind of updated blended learning approach. Their suggestions are that 10% of all human learning should come in a formal context, meaning that it should come where there's actual assessment or test at the end of the learning. So traditional university systems and things where we get grades. 20% should come from developmental relationships, from coaches, from mentors, from people internal to the organization, our boss, whatever it is. We should have that 20%. Now, the real piece of learning is the 70%, which is the experiential learning piece or component. And how do we get that, right? We have to figure out ways to create that for our people. So whether it's joining boards of directors external, whether it's doing cross-functional committee work internal to the business, whether it's helping them start their own business on the side, there's so many things that we can do that ramp up that experiential learning in a way that challenges them and it stretches them and it pushes them forward in ways that they wouldn't. What are we doing internal to our businesses, but also external to remove the potential barriers to success so that they can learn? Because everybody learns differently. And if we get really heavily focused just on helping them learn via the 10%, which most organizations do, they offer tuition reimbursement, they're missing out on the other 90%. We as leaders have to think about employee engagement doesn't just happen via the 10% or some sort of $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 reimbursement. It actually comes from things that are very low cost that could be in a lot of different ways. Are there other things that your respective organizations are doing that are not tuition reimbursement that help with learning? Not yet. Maybe after today. Maybe you think about like something else to do, because think about mentors and reverse mentorship. Like these are very, very low cost where you can learn things online and set up inside your organizations with almost no money. It's just a matter of, are the leaders inside your organization willing to distribute the time into it? And if so, that's fantastic. So to me, removing the barriers, providing knowledge and opportunity to people is so critical, but we don't think about these alternative paths. We only tend to think about tuition reimbursement or the 10% of human learning. We have to think about those other ways too. 1027, I just talked about a second ago. The fifth method, thinking about how do we create that learning organization. Has anybody here heard of Google X or a guy named Astro Teller? No? He is director, president of Google X. And what Google X is that's like their innovation arm within Google, if you will. They do something that's really, really unique. So you want to learn more about him, go to TED.com, type in his name, and you can watch a quick 15-minute video about what Google X does. Now, they do a lot of really interesting things, but most importantly, what they do when things are not going well and somebody fails or somebody makes a massive mistake, they throw a tremendous party. They throw a party. Now, you think about an organization wasting or making a mistake and spending a few $1 million on something that doesn't come through. Most people would be mad by that. They actually make cakes and have balloons and do a lot to kind of celebrate it. So they do great with lessons learned. They're trying to find a way to share those lessons learned with other people. So Google X is a fun thing to consider. Does anybody here celebrate mistakes? Talk about them openly? John does for sure. In the back, a couple of people. How do you celebrate mistakes? You can't do that. Is there a way to celebrate mistakes in another way that isn't tied to the books?
How you overcome the mistake.
Right.
How you correct them.
And Jenny's saying that as she's carrying a bottle of wine around, FYI. So, are there other ways to celebrate mistakes that aren't connected to something related to accounting? Are there things that you guys could do?
I guess you don't even have to celebrate it, but it becomes accepting it. Okay, great. Now what? Let's talk about it. So it's really just embracing it as part of the process.
Right.
For me.
Well said. Yep. That's the thing, is that younger people, millennials, which are now the largest percentage of the workforce, that's what they want. They want to make mistakes. They want to learn. They want coaching. They want ongoing feedback. We as leaders have to bake that into the culture of our business. So even if you don't celebrate mistakes the way that Google X does, it's still important that you recognize that it's an important piece of the process. Whether it's on a Monday morning meeting and you guys do a lessons learned review, or you have some sort of an internal whiteboard where everybody can see the lessons learned, it's completely up to you how you do it. But sharing those lessons learned is a key competency for your business to make sure that other people inside the organization don't make the same mistake. because that's pretty critical, is that we don't want other people doing it too. If you allow your people to make mistakes and you maybe celebrate them or give them more chances at autonomous choice, the probability of them really thoroughly being engaged is far, far higher, because they're going to know that they can take risks and put themselves out there and not do things that potentially hurt their employment. Because oftentimes in finance or accounting, people fear one of two things, or a combination, is that they fear criticism of their work product or they fear loss of long-term security. Underlying these fears, we have to think about how do we help them not feel those things so that they feel comfort in taking a couple of risks and being engaged and moving stuff forward. But that's a big one that I don't think we think about. 1027 we covered. What are we doing to manage those lessons learned, offering continual appreciation? I think when you guys all go home tonight or tomorrow, you're probably going to take the 5 love languages and like figure out what you are. Just so you guys know, it's free. It doesn't cost anything. It's like super easy. But there's also a professional version that if you really wanted to do it, languagesofappreciation.com, which is the same company. The difference is that they charge you $10 to take it. You can do the 5 love languages for free, or you can take the languages of appreciation for $10 per person. So you pick. How are we doing on time, Jenny? We doing all right? Or Susan?
Well, until this door.
Okay. She's like what she said.
Yeah.
I'll cover one thing. I'm not going to go through these slides in depth, but they're available, or Susan can send them out however you wish to see them. When I'm thinking about a one-to-one coaching process, what I'm really looking for is how can I move a person from being stuck in the old, which is the ending, kind of losing the letting go, move them into a place of being neutral, like a little bit of a toe in the past, but a little bit of acceptance of what's coming next, or how do I move them into the new beginning? And there are steps that you can take under each of these to get them going forward. And it's just a matter of, are you going to devote the time to get them to go from the left-hand side to the right-hand side as quickly as possible. And this comes from William Bridges in the Managing Transitions model. I'm not going to go through these, but there are things that if a person's skeptical that you can do for them really quickly, or if the person's neutral, the skeptical tactics plus these things, which I could give you examples of later, or if they're already on board with whatever the change is, here's what we would do to get them moving forward, to get the rest of the team on board too. And when you're thinking about coaching and some of the best practices, we talked a little bit about communications, we talked about change needing to happen quickly, how do we align employee reward systems, how do we train not just on hard skills, but also on some of those soft skills. And kind of as a joke, somebody asked me to put this into it, but if you have an employee, like John was talking about earlier, who are part of those folks that need to be yanked, we can always say really, really politely that we can promote those underperforming employees to customer. It's meant to be a joke, to be like, hey, they don't need to be a part of your team, but if they become one of your customers, that's a nice thing too. They can go to the competitors, whatever it is. I know it's time for wine. I'm like seeing wine on the tables. A little bit less than an hour, right? We were able to talk about quite a few things with regards to social norm changes and societal changes. And we were able to talk about these things are definitely happening, right? We have to be very, very cognizant and aware of them. And what are we going to do to drive that deep level of employee engagement? Because as you saw, roughly 70% of people who are working in America don't like their work. If we want to think about a new way to be the cat as opposed to the mouse or the rat, we have to do things a little bit differently in ways that we would not have before. So 5 things that we talked about were strategies or methods that we could find to engage them differently than maybe we've considered before. And then we can use the one-to-one coaching process if they're struggling a little bit to get from point A to point B. Here's my contact information. If you have questions or if you guys just want to talk for 20 to 30 minutes someday about all of this stuff and say, hey, here's what I'm struggling with inside of my business, just email me, text me, call me. I'm more than happy to talk with you for 30 minutes, no charge to you. It's just about helping you through the process and saying, hey, I'm struggling with this. How do I get through it? Right? What is it that I need to do? Susan and I were talking earlier. So here's the graphic for my podcast. The probability of me recording what we were just talking about and pushing it out on a podcast is high, hence the lapel mic. If you wanted to re-listen to this, you could just listen to whatever episode it is on the podcast. Reach out to me if you have questions about this, or listen to the podcast again if there's some piece or information that you wanted to get again. But Susan, you're welcome to distribute the slides and those points to people. Take it back to your organizations, use it, try to find a way to engage people more deeply because there's clearly a need in our society for it to happen. And so what can we do to increase that level of engagement so that whatever change is happening inside your respective businesses, we find a way to get through it really, really smoothly. I think it's time for wine.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you guys.
Questions?
John's got a question.
You mentioned Pam.
Okay.
Give me one overarching thing that she engaged with you to bring you to where you are.
Yeah. So Pam did something for me that was really super critical, and it has actually become a part of my coaching process, is that she did two major things. One was she gave me a battery of personality inventory assessments. So DISC and What Motivates Me, StrengthsFinder, Career Leader. And I saw myself for the first time ever in black and white on a sheet of paper. Like, this is how I communicate, this is what motivates me, here's my emotional intelligence. I didn't know those things before. So then when it hits you on a piece of paper that has a basically almost 100% validity score, meaning it's you, it's like, oh, well, that's who I am. And then it told me, you need to not be working in a small family business, or you need to not be working in hospitality, which I was briefly. It said you need to be working in HR or running a not-for-profit. So it completely changed the way that I looked at the world, because I thought that I was only going to be doing this one thing. I had all this information about myself in black and white, said I needed to be doing something else. So then as I started to call people, do informational interviews, explore those careers, talk to people who were in that, right? And I was like, okay, I could really do that. And that actually is interesting to me. Like, I want that. Her showing me that was obviously a big one for me. But number two is that she allowed for me to become the most unique version of myself. And I shared with you that I worked for my dad. He just wanted me to be, a robot inside the system. And I didn't want that. And she was like, Mike, these are the things that are absolutely unique and interesting about you. How do you share those strengths with the world around you in a way that you haven't been able to before? And so she started to give me ideas and allow me to talk to people that allowed me to share those unique strengths with other people. And that was so critical. So I saw myself in black and white, and then I saw myself as being this really unique person who had strengths that I didn't think of before. And then I saw how valuable they were in the marketplace. So then all of a sudden, from pre-MBA to post-MBA, my salary was about 2.5 times higher, just because of those two small little things that she did to build my confidence and allow me to go out there and try things. It totally changed the game for me in a big way. Thank you. Other questions? You guys are super rad. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Equal Chance to Be Unequal. I'm Michael S. Seaver. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on iTunes and like, share, or comment on this podcast on michaelsseaver.com, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, or YouTube. Go forth and be awesome.